I'm going to quote Samuel Johnson again. Samuel Johnson, that British literary figure. He once said that people don't need to be informed, they don't need to be taught as much as they need to be reminded. I'm going to remind you of something that you know. You know how powerful story is. You use story every day. Story has inspired you. You've used story to inspire others. Story creates meaning around ideas and events and information, and you used story to communicate important, meaningful ideas to folks. I've used story as a storyteller throughout my entrepreneurial career, but it wasn't until the last few years that I became really very mindful about the power of story and intentional in my use and my thoughtfulness about how to use story. It really began when I was invited to teach at Duke University, and they invited me by saying to me, "Carl, just come tell us your stories." And when I looked at my career, I realized that what I had been in my career was a storyteller. Well, soon after beginning to develop story in my Duke classrooms, and what I learned was that when you don't know a lot about business, when you don't know a lot of business jargon, it's really very useful and to be able to find other ways to talk about business concepts with students. And I found that many of the business concepts I wanted to communicate, I could communicate through the concept of story. Well, soon thereafter, I was invited to speak at North Carolina State University. North Carolina State had taken on a very important task at the time. This was soon after the dot-com bubble burst, soon after the NASDAQ bubble burst, when about 65% of the software developers in the Research Triangle Park area lost their jobs. And what North Carolina State was doing is they were holding a series of quarterly sessions that were designed to bring these unemployed software developers together and keep them abreast about the latest technological developments in their specialty software areas, in their specialty development areas, to keep them fresh so that when job opportunity came along, they would be current. They'd understand the current knowledge, the current trends. Well, after about a year or so of doing these quarterly meetings, the software development community in the Triangle got another hard blow, and that was when, as the economy was now starting to return after the bubble burst, companies were learning about the power of outsourcing. So yes, new jobs were being created, but so very many of those jobs were going overseas, and so the software developers were continuing to have problems finding employment. Even if they were up to speed on their craft, they were still having a hard time finding employment. So they asked the folks at North Carolina State, who were conducting these seminars, these quarterly seminars, they asked them to add some additional content to these seminars. They asked them to please now come with speakers who could talk about how to write a business plan, how to write a marketing plan, because they were going to become entrepreneurial out of necessity. If nobody would hire them, they would go out and create their own job, and they wanted to learn how to be an entrepreneur. And I was asked to be one of the folks that was going to come in and talk to them about how to become an entrepreneur. I was asked specifically to take on the marketing portion. And as I looked at a room of 40 or 45 guys, and I remembered what it was like to work with technology people who very frequently aren't enthusiastic about marketing, and when I read their body language and saw their reactions as I was introduced as the person who was going to talk about marketing, I had an insight. And the insight was expressed in the following fashion. I said to them as I began, I said, let me ask you all a couple of questions. Let me ask you if you have ever used story in the following fashion. Have you ever had to take your two little girls, your 2-year-old and your 4-year-old daughter, and prepare them for bed? And you've dressed them in their favorite pajamas, and you've put their favorite music on, and you've put the shade over the light, the cloth over the light to create the right tone, the right color, and the whole time that you're preparing them, you're telling your daughters that as you put them to bed, you're going to tell them a story that only a princess can hear. And you know that by the time you've put them to bed and by the time you're ready to tell them that story, regardless of what story you tell them, it will be a story that only princesses can hear in their minds and in their imagination. There's an example of the power of story. Another example of the power of story. I asked these people Oh, by the way, when I asked them if they've ever used story in that fashion, they sort of giggled. They sort of wondered who this goofy guy was that was talking to them about story. But about half of them raised their hand and suggested that yes, indeed, they had used story in that fashion. I then asked them if they'd used story in the following fashion. When they were 9 or 10 or 11 years old, had they ever done something like this? Had they ever told their father that they could hit 7 out of 10 free throws, even though they weren't yet capable of hitting 7 out of 10 free throws, but that you knew that by putting that story in the world, by speaking that story out loud, by creating that beginning of a reality, that it would hold you to its truth, that it would make it more likely that you would discipline yourself and work at finally accomplishing 7 out of 10 free throws, and you would use story to manage your behavior. And once again, about half the people raised their hands. And when they did, I said, well, then you know all you need to know about marketing, because marketing is nothing more than using story in some fashion like that, in some way that creates a reality that you live into and that your audience lives into. And so we spent the next 3 hours talking about marketing without ever using the M word, just simply talking about how to build a story, how to create a story, the techniques of story, and how to make sure that the story that you're creating is the very best story that your audience wants to hear.